Hey, it's Jordan. Hope everyone's doing okay. I'm joined by Lee Merritt. You are the attorney for the John family. Botham John was a 26-year-old African American. He was killed on September 6th by a off-duty Dallas police officer, Amber Geiger. Amber Geiger was fired a couple weeks after that, but her story, from all objective lenses has changed dramatically. Leah, I wanted to start. You have been involved as an attorney in a lot of these cases where black men have been murdered. This is obviously different. This is not a traffic stop turned into a murder. This is not, a Trayvon Martin situation by some vigilante witness protection person. This is someone in their apartment. Can you kind of talk about what's different about this compared to other cases and other deceased men that you've been representing?
Well, the facts of the case are most different because of the excuse offered. In this case, it wasn't I mean, we sort of hear the same excuse of failed to comply, but this is a man who allegedly failed to comply in his own household because the officer alleged to have mistaken a fact about where she was when she ended up in his home. The more I look at this case, and I've been able to sit with it over a month now, it's eerily similar to a lot of cases. This is not the first person of color who was killed in their own home by law enforcement because they failed to comply. Uh, the absurdity of the initial excuse offered, I believe, sort of thrust this forward where she thought she was in her own home, and in the other cases that I've been involved in, that we see, like for example, Charlene Lyles, who was killed in her own home in Seattle, I believe, the pregnant mother who was alleged to have been reaching for a knife. Um, uh, the difference in this case is that law enforcement claimed a right to be there because of a call or for some other investigative purpose. This officer acknowledges that she had no right to be in Mr. Jones' house, um, but she thought that she was in her own house, and that in her mind, she was being burglarized. Uh, that aside, the character assassination that I see in every one of my cases is present in every one of the cases that we see nationally where the victim becomes the villain. We see that present. Uh, the failure to comply language. The only thing that's missing, sort of mysteriously, is fear for my life. And I imagine at some point Miss Geiger will have to add that to her narrative, and so we'll see the story change again, because otherwise it's actually still murder. If she was still in her home, even if she had been in her home as she thought she was in her mind, and she saw someone, and she gave that person commands, and they refused to comply, the law, the use of force uh, uh, spectrum doesn't allow a law enforcement officer to use deadly force in that case. They first have to articulate some facts that put them or members of the general public in danger. And in the two narratives that she's offered, in the prevailing narrative, that's absent. So I imagine it will appear at some other point, as we see happen in most cases. But even then, we believe the case will be strong enough to convict Amber Geiger for murder. We still don't know what happened. And so, generally, in these kind of cases, we like to offer a counter narrative or a narrative more consistent with the facts. We know she entered his home and shot him in the heart, and she had no right to be there, and he had every right to be there. That he was unarmed. Why she entered his home, we don't know. We know that what she says is not true because it's demonstratively false, and it keeps changing. But we don't know the real story behind it.
I want to read a line from the arrest affidavit. There was a search warrant affidavit and then an arrest affidavit within, I think, 2 or 3 days of each other. The stories dramatically changed. I haven't seen much talked about with this particular line, but to me, it doesn't make sense. It says Geiger turned on the interior lights while on the phone with 911. Upon being asked where she was located by emergency dispatchers, Geiger returned to the front door to observe the address and discovered she was at the wrong apartment. Well, if you thought it was your apartment, what, obviously there's adrenaline. She just shot someone, but why is it that if she thought it was her apartment, she had to get up, walk to the door, and look at the number, and that's when the light bulb went off that it wasn't her apartment?
Yeah, that always read very, very, very strange to me that she's on the phone with dispatch. They ask her what's her address. And we know that those calls are going to be recorded, so they couldn't change the narrative there dramatically. So she pauses, she goes back to look at the apartment number and says, "Hey, this isn't my apartment number." It's very, very, very strange, but it's not inconsistent with the oddities of that evening. Law enforcement officers are trained to observe, but you don't have to be a trained observer to know that you're standing on a big, bright red rug that is not at your apartment complex. In her first version of events, she put things down as she tried to go to the door. So she put things down near her feet where she would have been standing on a red rug that's not in front of her carpet. It's not in front of her apartment. I'm sorry. There is that uh, big, bright, illuminated apartment number next to theirs. That apartment complex, the Southside Flats, goes out of their way to really highlight what apartment number you're in. There's the red indicator on the door. When you put your key into the wrong light, into the wrong lock, it flashes red to let you know, again, not your apartment. And then you're right. Once you're inside of the apartment, number one, as soon as you enter this particular apartment, the lights are to the right. And if it's so dark that you can't see the details of your apartment, most people naturally, their natural instinct is to hit those lights to illuminate the apartment. It's the first thing available to you when you enter. Um, and then, assuming she didn't do that, the moment she hit those lights, then her apartment would have been illuminated, and she could see all around that nothing in his apartment was consistent with hers. He was a very religious man. He had a number of religious signage around his home. His apartment was different. It smelled like a bachelor's pad. Even when I went in there days after he was murdered, it still smelled like men's cologne. And he had his bachelor furniture, and he didn't do his dishes very well. And it was just a different apartment, right? So,
And I wanted to ask you, it seems to me she had days to go home, scrub her social media. I don't know if this is true or not, but something I read, she had a Pinterest account where there was some things on there that kind of echoed a little of, not in these words, but a little Blue Lives Matter and, police superiority. Besides the fact that they have not released the 911 call, is this common where an officer involved in a shooting would be given that kind of time and would be allowed to scrub social media or anything like that?
yeah, it's quite common in cases of law enforcement officers. And we're dealing with cases very similar to the murder of Botham, where law enforcement officers are given every break, every leeway possible. They're given a chance when there is body camera footage to review that, to craft their narrative around it, to scrub their social media. In the scrubbing of the social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, it does appear that they looked over the Pinterest account. My sources, my investigators have been able to verify that at least that wasn't a new account, it wasn't a mock account, that it was an account that existed for years for a police officer in Dallas County named Amber Geiger. And so our verification back mechanisms have confirmed that that was her account, and there were some very scary things on that account. She bragged about being violent, being short-tempered. She bragged about use of force, and she spoke out adamantly against things like kneeling, and said the NFL died of colon cancer, or referring to Colin Kaepernick. She said people were lucky that when she went through the week without killing someone or stabbing someone in the neck. She expressed some very, very dark thoughts. She celebrated one shot, one kill, and this militarization of law enforcement, and assuming that information will be available at the time of trial. We just had a trial of a police officer in the area, Roy Oliver, and some of those kind of deep, dark thoughts that expressed themselves in social media came out during the trial, and they were very powerful. I believe those will play a role in Miss Geiger's trial as well.
Right. And, if you can't reveal some of this, that's fine. But I wanted to ask, you have reports that there was some noise complaints against both of them. He was on the fourth floor. She was right under him on the third floor. Obviously, other people on that floor have said they heard banging, let me in, let me in. Everyone I talked to down there, obviously you've spoken with more people, according to them, they have no knowledge of Botham or Amber knowing each other. Did from what you've investigated, your investigators, is it possible that there was an existing relationship, even if it was just her complaining of noise?
Yeah. So my conclusion outside of noise complaints, they didn't know each other, and the noise complaints that both of them had from his downstairs neighbor, they began prior to Miss Geiger getting there. But there's certainly the possibility that some of the noise complaints, even one from that day, could be connected to her. The apartment complex, I think they're concerned that they may share some of the liability here, and they haven't been completely forthcoming with all the information that we need. But from witness statements from people who are close to both of them, who spoke to them about these noise complaints and other concerns, there's a strong possibility that Miss Geiger may have complained to both of them, even or not to both of them, but about both of them, and so they were sort of tangentially connected in that way, and it may very well have a lot to do with this incident. But that investigation is still ongoing.